Welcome to the Black Male Impact. Today we have as guest Dr. Mahaliel Bethea. Dr. Bethea, welcome to the Black Male Impact.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as always, our goal is to share how we can make a difference as Black men in our community. But before we get into the conversation itself, would you mind share with the listeners so they can get an understanding of who you are before we get into the questions itself?
Yes, and again, thank you, Dr. Cross, for having me. I am Dr. Mahaliel Bethea. I have the privilege of serving as the director for My Brother's Keeper and My Sister's Keeper initiatives with the New York City Department of Education. Before that, leading up to this role, it's been about 16 years in the field of education, all of which were dedicated to the social, emotional, and academic growth of Black and brown boys. And so I started in the Bronx at an all-boys school as a history teacher, both US and global, became a dean, grade team leader, department chair, moved into a founding principal position. So I opened up an all-boys school in Harlem, New York, Eagle Academy for Young Men of Harlem, before transitioning into this role at the Chancellor's Office.
Man, that's awesome. But I have been watching the impact of with Black males and My Brother's Keeper. But what was that experience like working with the My Brother's Keeper initiative?
Yeah, so I think for me it was a natural fit. Again, because of my work, I'm a Bronx native, right? Shout out to the Boogie Down. For those who are familiar with New York City, I'm Bronx through and through. But in terms of the work of My Brother's Keeper, for us, and there are two of us that currently are the team that manages the citywide initiative, myself and Mr. George Patterson. But we view our role as creating space, creating access and opportunity, and reshaping narratives that are currently out there. So for us, the work the best part of the work for us is really about creating narrative shifts and really reimagining the conversation and the archetypes that exist in people's heads when they think about who our young men are. And so for us, we've seen the brightness and the brilliance, and we understand that to be a true statement. We understand that to be a norm and not so much an exception to the rule. So part of our role and our experience and the way that we measure our impact is what is our ability to actually change hearts and minds? What's our ability, and to what degree are we able to create spaces by way of access and opportunity that allow people to see our young men in different light, in different spaces, on a different mission?
Man, that's awesome. And we know the narrative that surrounds Black men or Black boys and stuff like that. So working with those young men, what was it like for you in regards to knowing the narrative? Was it a challenging experience? I know you said it was like a perfect fit. What was it? What was the challenge? Was there a challenge?
I think as a teacher, as a school-based administrator, there were always challenges. Okay. Because sometimes the reality is, even though I saw my young men in one light, sometimes they didn't see themselves in the same light. Sometimes they didn't view themselves as positive contributors to society, as individuals that could literally grow up to be whatever they wanted to be. These are things that some of us, I've had the privilege of being raised in a household that was just what I believed, right? I believed that if I wanted to be a lawyer, I could be a lawyer. If I wanted to be a doctor, I could be a doctor. And my parents instilled that in me. And what I realized when I started teaching was, oh, this actually isn't the mindset that all of our young men have. The real talk about it that wasn't the mindset that all teachers had. That wasn't the mindset that their parents had. And so there were challenges and again, changing hearts and minds. There were challenges in presenting a reality that they may have not seen before, right? And to say, no, actually, yeah, he made this error, he made this mistake, particularly when I was a dean, because usually I was dealing with students who got in trouble, right, as a dean. And so having those conversations with parents and saying, well, this is just an error. This doesn't label them. This isn't a mark, right? Like we can come back from this. That was challenging at times.
Okay. And I know you mentioned something about social emotional learning. How would you explain that, especially dealing with Black males?
Yeah, so for me, when I'm looking at kind of what is the social emotional work for Black and brown males, I think first of all, it's around identity, right? It's
Okay.
around being able to connect the historic excellence of Black and brown people to them. I think that that to me is at the foundation of the work that we're doing when we're talking about kind of social emotional. I don't want to be, I don't like math because I don't believe I'm a mathematician, because I believe that is a thing that Asian children do,
Hmm.
right? That is not a real thing. We know where the origins of math come from, right? And so part of it is around being able to present that historic lens and connecting identity, their current identity, to excellence, right? And also naming and elevating the excellence that already exists. It's not always about, and in many cases, it's not about changing who our young men are, but about showing them the being asset based and showing them the excellence within themselves. Once that happens, I think the second big piece about, for me and in my experience, that social emotional piece is also about connection to other young men, right? And how do we create and build healthy relationships? How do we communicate with each other in a way that isn't yelling at each other about which team won the game on Monday, right? Like how do we shift the types of conversations that our young men are having with each other? And then finally, what's the advocacy piece? And how do we support our young men in developing ways to advocate for themselves in a way that can be received by those who they need in their advocacy journey, right? And so if I'm a child in special education, for example, how do I advocate my needs, right? I'm 16 years old, right? I may still be in special education. How do I advocate for myself in a way that isn't a response to frustration? Because a lot of times what we may see is we may see responses to frustration, and we're like, why is he angry? Because he's been trying to tell you for months that maybe he doesn't need this thing, or maybe he does need this thing, and you're not giving it to him. And so those are kind of the three buckets that I think through when I talk about and when I practice, right, the work of surrounding our young men from an SEL lens.
Man, I really appreciate the perspective of that historic excellence. And I think once we can let them see themselves through others, I think we can close the gap, or we can change that narrative
Yeah.
when it comes to Black males and what they say about Black males and how they learn in the classroom. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I think that's something that a lot of educators, our teachers, need to realize. It's not that they cannot do the work, but maybe the perspective they have, our perception of themselves, and
Yeah.
just to help them change the way they see themselves, can really shift how they show up in the classrooms.
Yeah, and I also want to name that also requires adults to do some work too, right? That requires that we as teachers, as administrators, as support to schools, that we do the internal work, right? And we say, well, what do I think about when I see a bunch of young Black and brown boys huddled up walking down the street? Like what goes through my mind? Do I cross the street? Right? Like what happens in terms of our ability, because if we're projecting negative, right, if we're projecting these negative thoughts and these negative perceptions onto our young men, they're already getting hit from every direction, right? They can Google, they can go on social media, they can see these things that don't feed the narrative of Black excellence, right? And so as adults, we have a role to play in checking our own bias, and really doing the reflective work and doing the mind work in our own heads, and being able to get in front of our young men, and to counter some of those thoughts that we may have had since we were children, right?
Correct.
To actively counter those thoughts, so that way we can create the space that will allow our young men to grow.
Man, I think that is important. And I'm glad that you shared that, because recently I saw a commercial that shows to us what would be considered the norm.
Mm.
And we make those judgments based on how we are conditioned. So we really have to change, because what the commercial was showing us was that it shows first part of what they think we would think, and they stop it in time, and then they show the positive. That's not.
Yes, I did see that commercial. It was actually a very eye-opening commercial. I'm so
Yes,
glad.
man.
Yes.
I was like, man, what, this is what we need to see more of. And just to get people to really think beyond those perceptions or the
Yeah.
misconceptions, especially when it comes to us, both black male and female, because it
Yes.
was showing both black males, females, and kids and stuff like that. So I was really impressed when I saw that commercial. I'm going to get into some of the questions that I have for you
Okay.
today. And as the focus is about empowering Black males and get us to really see how we can change the narrative. So my first question to you is, what is the mindset that it takes to make a positive impact?
I think I would offer up that there are mindsets, right?
Okay.
That of course, for me, a dominant mindset, and the author is escaping me in the moment, but I remember reading a book and it talked through about mindsets around black teaching in black and brown spaces. And one of the things that said, I am the determining factor in my student success, right? Like that was a primary mindset. And I think in this day and age, with so much that has happened to our teaching force, to our educator force around COVID and everything else going on, I think that is a mindset that is hard to maintain at a high level, right? To say like, I am the determining factor. I am the one who has control over whether or not the students that are in front of me, right, do the thing that we need them to do, right? It's a big ask because there's so many factors that work against that. But I do believe having the mindset, right, of saying, you know what, actually, these things are in my locus of control. I have an authority, right, in this space to do a level of work. However, I've identified that, whether that be the work of teaching history, right, the work of ensuring that my young men leave my classroom able to advocate for themselves, whatever those things are,
Yeah.
I have a responsibility to, and I have control over to what extent my students are able to do that. I think that mindset, that resilience piece is something that is a primary driver. Some other mindsets that I have personally and that I believe impact how I show up in the work is find a way, make a way, right? We all know in education there are how do we say hurdles, right?
Yes.
There sometimes they're fire hoops that you got to jump through to
Right.
get the thing that you want to get. And for me, the mindset of find a way, make a way allows me to say, okay, so then what has to be true, right, to make this thing happen? I'll give you an example. At the time, I was just running a middle school, and we decided we didn't have gym space. And so we said, you know what, we partnered with the Boys Club of New York, and they said, well, there's a pool. And I was like, great, I want to teach my young men how to swim. A lot of them do not know how to swim. And so, of course, I'm like, I call legal, I call the superintendent. I'm like, we want to do this thing. And every time I spoke about the young men getting in water, I always got a response that I didn't ask for. Kind of always vague language, always kind of steering me away from it until the mindset of find a way, make a way kicked back in. And I said, well, I'm not asking your opinion about it. I'm telling you what must be true. I know other students do it. I know there are white children that get to do that. So in the same system. And so there is a process for how to do that. So you tell me what I have to do, how many hoops, how many letters I have to sign, how many petitions I need to get, and we're going to get it done. And I got my guys to that pool, right? Because that mindset of find a way, make a way was so important. Those are kind of the two primaries for me. Not kind of, they are the two primaries for me. And I think other mindsets come into play situationally, but
Yeah.
those are the two that drive all of my actions.
Well, I really appreciate the perspective from being that determining factor, and have understand that we as individuals can make things happen, and how we show up matters. And once we have that mindset that I am the determining factor, I can make things happen, then how I show up in the space will be different. And I think approaching life in that manner will make us even more effective. And I really also like find a way or make a way, because on this journey, we're not always going to have things how we want it. And
Yes.
sometimes to get things done, we have to find a way to make it happen. And sometimes in having that mindset, it helps us to help others to see the importance of what we're trying to get done. And I think we approach things like that, knowing that we may have some hoops to jump through to get what we want done. We'll get more things done because not everyone is going to understand the need for what we're trying to accomplish. So I'll go into my next question, and it is, what advice do you have for the men listening and how they can play a role in creating positive change?
I think my immediate feedback is know thyself, right? Check your bias. I think in my experience of doing this work for 16 years, the thing that has actually shocked me the most is well-intentioned men of color showing up into spaces to support young men of color and doing harm.
Wow.
Not not because that's what they wanted to do, but because they they did not go through the work of reflection. They did not go through the work of healing. Because those are things that weren't, frankly, just weren't available to us. Like
Right.
all this healing and self-care stuff, like that, that's not at least for my generation,
The
like that is
norm.
not something that was like, oh, like let's do that every weekend, right? Like that just wasn't it. And so I I operated off of the assumption that if I could just get enough men in front of my young men, right, that would be enough. And it wasn't. And it wasn't because as I observed classrooms and as I watched interactions in the hallways and at lunch periods, I noticed that some of the bad habits that we had learned, right, were now being passed on, right, to these other young men. And so the biggest piece of advice I can give to any men on the call that are listening are make sure that you are in the process of reflection and healing for yourself. Make sure that you are checking your biases at the door. And make sure that you're clear about why you're in this space in the first place, right? The why, the do, and how we do it, it matters. It matters. A lot of people are like, oh, that's not an important question to ask people. And I would push and say it is probably one of the most important questions because it keeps your North Star. It allows you to say, on the day that I show up and my class is bugging out, on the day that I show up and my teacher staff is all sick, right? My why keeps me grounded and keeps me anchored in those storms. And so those are the three things I would offer up.
Well, from knowing thyself, I believe that is important when we're thinking about creating positive change. And one thing that you touch on that we really have to take in consideration as men is to make sure we don't pass on the things that have affected us, the bad habits, the bad practice. Although we want to create change, we have to make sure we are not instilling what may have stopped us from being the best version of ourselves. So I really appreciate that because sometimes we go in spaces and we, as you mentioned, that we may be doing more harm than good by passing on bad habits that have been instilling in us, where we don't check ourselves, where we don't look at why we may show up the way we do. And it's important, that we look at our own biases. Why do we show up the way we do? Why do we think the way we do? Why do we respond the way we do? Because certain things weren't the norm. And for us to change what we have been conditioned to
Mhm.
think about ourselves, we have to do some of that work ourselves. And that leads to my next question. How can we, as Black men, help to change the narrative today? And that can be from whichever perspective that you want to take it.
Yeah.
But how can we change the narrative?
I think the first thing is identifying there are so many narratives, right? And so I think the first part is being clear about the narrative you're attacking, right? I think the narratives are very specific to, or can be very specific to, attributes of the young man, right? And so the example I offer up is if there is a narrative that you want to counter around boys in sports, right? Like not every Black boy needs to play basketball. Like that's a narrative that you are trying to counter. Then you know how to show up for that. It is really daunting. And what I've seen in the past is people say, well, I want Black and brown boys to do better. That is a huge, daunting, that is a narrative that could be one out of your locus, right, of control. It could be just something just too big.
Yeah.
And I think that the way we attack any narrative, the way that we attack any what some people consider bad PR, right? Right, is we attack the things individually. And so I think we all, as men, regardless of our role, regardless of whether or not we are educators, the type of educator we are, where we serve in the country, I think there are narratives that are regional, right? I think in New York, there are certain things that are said that may or may not be said in Missouri, right?
Right.
And vice versa, right? So I think the biggest thing is to identify, like, what is the narrative you're trying to counter? Like what is the hill you're willing to die on? Like what are the things that keep you up at night when you're in the teacher's lounge and you hear the cringy comment about the student of color, insert here, right? That allows us to come at a lot of different angles. So identifying the narrative or the narratives that you are able and ready to attack, I think is going to be the key.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because sometimes to change or create change, we can spread this broad blanket, and maybe it's not creating the change that we want, and identifying that area to focus on. It could be to get more, as you were mentioning, not just saying change what Black males do, but to get more Black males to say do STEM and
Yeah.
see the value in STEM and don't have that perception that Black males don't do STEM. So
Yep.
everything that we'll do would focus maybe around STEM and get Black males to see the value in STEM. I think that is really helpful in regards to creating change, just to be specific on the area
Yeah.
that would like to see change happen in.
It's
So,
huge. It's huge because the work that we're talking about is not short term.
correct.
The narrative, the reimagining or changing the narratives that exist for Black men, for Black and brown boys. This ain't gonna go away next year, right? This is, and if we are not clear, the consequences, we get tired, we get caught up, right? Because we get lost in the grandeur that is the narrative. So some things to think about.
Yeah, I think that is important because I even remember when I started the journey saying I want to create change. It wasn't until I become more specific that what the work that I'm going to do is going to focus more on Black men and Black
Yeah.
boys to see what we need to do to change, and just shifting my mindset. It helps me to dive deeper to understand some of the challenges that we may have and start helping me to make those connections that I need to. I think that is important when it comes to creating positive change. But I know you have been in education for a long time. So my next question is, what or who has influenced or inspired you to pursue the path that you're on?
Mentors are are not they're not something that are just for kids, right? I think particularly in the ed field, being that we are such a small percentage of the workforce, mentors become a game changer if you engage and align yourself with the right mentors. And so for me, there are men that served in various capacities. I'm thinking about my first principal, Jonathan Foy, our founding school director, Kamal Patel. Like there are a few brothers who saw something I didn't see. I was just there to teach history. I really wasn't. I was like, I think this school is great. I want to teach history. That's what makes me happy. I want to take kids abroad, and just kind of being given the space, and in some instances it being named for me. Oh, like you should consider this thing. Had they not said that to me, I probably would have never considered becoming a principal or becoming a dean or becoming a central employee. And so for me, mentors had a huge role to play in my decision making. They still do, right? I keep a small group of mentors around me. And whenever I'm ready to make a move, I engage them to see kind of what makes the most sense. And that matters. And I think that I think that we're not trained up enough to understand that that even like that to me is not an optional affair, right? It's like, hey, like, oh, maybe if you have time, go get a mentor. Like for me, had I not had those individuals in my life, I actually don't know where I would have been in terms of my career trajectory. Not to say I wouldn't have been successful, because I do believe because of my parents, the community that raised me, they had set me up to do great work and to do great things. But it was my mentors that took that baton and really showed me the ropes.
I do, as you mentioned, mentorship, and that it's not only for the young ones, but also for us as we go through the journey for our own success. I believe having mentors to navigate the way is important.
Yes.
But as you said, with mentorship, suppose those who are listening don't have a mentor. How would you suggest, if you don't mind, to get a mentor?
Yeah.
What's the process if they think they can't find one?
So I think the first thing I want to state is that mentoring doesn't have to be this formal sit down thing. And I think it's also important that we identify the why for our mentors. So there are mentors that I have that are really focused on my career journey, right? I'm like, these are individuals that I seek advice from, that I watch. And the great part about social media is and technology is that we can be mentored by people that don't even know us.
That's
Right?
right.
We can watch tapings like this. We can listen to podcasts, right? And we can identify kind of who are these individuals that we're ready and willing to listen to and guide our steps. So the first thing I would say, I guess, in terms of advice is, what do you need mentoring for?
Right.
Right. Sometimes I've had people come up to me and say, hey, I would like you to be my mentor. And I'm like, well, that's great. And I'm fine with that. But like, what do you need?
Correct.
Like, is it financial advice? I'm not the guy, right? Like I'm not expert there. Is it like you relational? Like what is the thing that you need? And then identifying, because we all have strengths.
Yes.
And so ultimately, we want mentors that are going to do two things. One, that are going to feed our strengths, right? And keep that fire going and remind us even when we trip, right? No, that's still a strength that hasn't changed. And there's also mentors that you have that are trying to fill or supporting you in filling gaps that you've identified. And so my biggest piece of advice there would be, like, again, you got to do the reflection work. You got to do self-assessment and say, these are the things that I need. And then identify, if you can't find those folks in your immediate circle, what are some of the venues or avenues that you can engage in, or that you can enter, that will get you what you need. We got Zoom, right? We have all, like, you can be in Texas and have a mentor in Alaska and have normal conversations. And so for me, people talk about the importance of therapy, which I agree with. And when people are doing that virtual, I would say the same thing with mentoring, right? Like that is something that men of color in the field of education really should consider, in terms of kind of growing their trajectory, expanding their network base, and putting themselves in positions where they have choice, right? Versus kind of, because if left up to chance, there's still systematic, right? There's still systematic current, right? And no, Black men, we all don't have to be deans of discipline,
Correct.
right? But if that's all we know, because that's what's in front of us and that's what people are feeding us, then we don't know, oh, you can have impact in this space or this work and still be connected to kids and not have to be the disciplinarian all the time, which in many cases, unfortunately, that's kind of the roles that that have been pegged for us. And so
When it comes to mentoring, I really appreciate that which you share, because a lot of people would say sometimes, man, I can't find a mentor. But two things that you said that is really important, that we find out what area do we want the mentorship in, and realize that we don't have to have someone right across from us.
yes,
When it comes to mentorship or mentoring, we can learn from individuals who we see modeling what we want to learn, and they can be anywhere. Now with technology, it's even easier to learn because we can just go on Zoom or one of those ways to communicate and have those conversations. But it's important that for seeking mentorship is to have an understanding of where do you want that mentorship, and that realize that you don't have to have that person in your immediate circle to be mentored by those individuals. So I really appreciate that perspective. So my next question, and you may have touched on it with your previous answers, but I'm still going to ask, what is your perspective on the current climate of Black men in society today?
the best way I can put in connection to climate is that the seasons are changing, right? I think because of we are finding by way of a lot of access vehicles, and again, I mentioned social media, we're finding that people are identifying the niche markets and the niche narratives. And so I think of things like all the amazing work I'm seeing with organizations like the Dad Gangs and like Dad Gang and things like that that are saying, actually, no, we are present, right, in our children's lives. That this narrative of the absent Black father actually is false, right? And we can prove it.
Correct.
And so we're seeing people chipping away at these
False
negative
narratives.
narratives, right? About these deficit mindsets around who we are as Black men and brown men, who we are as men of color, and who we are in various roles and positions and obligations. And so I think the climate is changing. To what season, I don't know, right? And I'm one to not believe that. I don't believe summer is better than winter or spring is better than fall, but I do see wherever we were, right? There is evidence, right? Even as a practitioner, right? I can now, in ways I couldn't do 15 years ago, I can point to the thing and say, oh, the same way that as a history teacher, I felt it important to travel and show my kids, oh, like that place in the textbook is actually a real place. Here's a picture of it. Here's me standing in front of it, right? I think that we're now able to point at models of Black excellence, of positive male interactions, of discourse in ways that again contribute to the larger Black excellence movement, I would say. Men showing up in places where people, for some reason, claim them to be absent. Like I said, fatherhood, but
Yeah.
also things like active, like there's a lot of different spaces. And so I think that for me, it's exciting to see where we are climate wise. And I'm hoping that will eventually manifest itself into better times.
Well, as you mentioned, the groups that have been formed to change the perspective, which not only change the perspective of the men themselves, but also the larger society, to give them something different. Yes, because we have been seen based on how the broader society have been conditioned to see us and what they have been told in different medias, what we do as Black men. And I think, as you mentioned, where we show up in different spaces and doing the work and letting society know that no, what you have heard or what you have been thinking about when it comes to us, that's not true. But being that you're a part of the My Brother's Keeper, and I know that President Obama started that initiative. But do you think that's right? That's right. So, do you think by President Barack Obama being president, how does that affect us as Black men? You think?
Yeah, so I think there's as like a former history teacher, I think there's a lot of debate about how former President Obama's beliefs impacted policy, right, for a variety of different groups. That's always going to be up for debate.
Yeah.
What I don't think is up for discussion is him using his voice and platform to systematically reset something,
Correct.
right? That being, right, the work and allowing us to be unapologetic about how we show up for Black and brown boys. To me, that's undisputed. And I think that what we hadn't seen, or what we haven't seen at that level, was someone say the thing. I think that leaders have an imperative, a moral imperative, right? To say, no, I'm going to actually say the thing that many of you may be thinking but can't say because of a lot of different factors. And when he got up on stage and when he said, Trayvon could have been my kid, when he said, when he shed a tear, right? And brought, I think people saw humanity. He gave us a window, right? And then said, I'm going to do something about it. It wasn't so like, oh, I'm sad that this happened. I'm emotional, and let's move on to the next thing. He said, no, I'm going to put an effort. I'm going to create this initiative. I'm going to challenge cities to sign on to this thing and to really be thoughtful about this thing. And there are now over 250 communities, right, within the MBK Alliance. And so I think that his position and not only his position, but his willingness to say, I'm going to use that position to say the thing, right, had a huge impact on, like, I wouldn't be able to be in this position if it wasn't for that, right? We wouldn't have grants available to, we always have stuff on the edges, right? Kind of on the outskirts, right? There was always these opportunities for certain organizations to be able to do good work by Black and brown boys, but never have we seen at such a high level when we now have entire cities, mayoral offices that are dedicated to this work. And I believe that's because of what he did and what he said and how he said it.
Well, yes, man. I've seen some of those excited pictures and seen the video when he shows up in those spaces with these young men. It's like now they see possibilities just by him being there. But just him creating the initiative in itself, I know the impact because I'm seeing it, in different spaces. I've seen it in Chicago. I've seen it in New York. I've seen it in different places. So I believe, especially when these young men see him, I can see the excitement on your faces.
It's a different type of startup, right?
Yes.
It's not prior the conversation, like who were the stars, right? Who were our young people looking up to, particularly our young men? They were looking up to athletes, right? And there's nothing wrong with them looking up to athletes, but ultimately, that's not it, right? Like that's not the only place where we are excellent, right?
Yeah.
And so looking up to music artists and looking up to athletes is great. I think he also he kind of wedged, a new lane. He said, actually, there's these other people that I would argue are folks that we need to be putting up on pedestals.
Correct.
And this is nothing new. This isn't new work.
Correct.
Right. This isn't new language or new messaging. But again, him being where he was at the time and doing that while he was a sitting president.
Correct.
Right. Had huge ramifications, I believe, in the positive around kind of how this work is now embedded in the fabric of so many communities across the US.
Oh, I do believe, because you can see the difference. And that's what is important. You see the evidence of the work. So the impact is there and we can see it. So my next question is, what was a pivotal moment in your life? It can be from teaching and seeing, just working with the students that you have been working with.
I think I've been lucky. I've been blessed enough, right? And luck is not the word, right? I've been blessed enough to have several pivotal moments. So I'll focus on one that kind of speaks to career. And this goes back to mentoring, and this goes back to the power of words. And I was a grade team leader at the time, and my principal had asked me to complete some task, but I could only do the task on his computer, right? And so he's out and about, and I'm in his principal's seat, and I am typing away. And he walked into the room, and he goes, "You know, you look really good in that seat."
Wow.
And I joke with him to this day because I'm like, I don't even know if you remember saying that to me, but I never forgot it, right? And when he said that, I was like, you know what? I do look good in this principal seat. Like that's the thing I want to do. And I think that we sometimes it's those really short. He never sat me down and was like being a print like this is why you should be like it was never any of that. It was literally that moment in time. I happened to be in the seat, and that's what he said to me. And the pivot was, okay, so now I'm actually seeking administration, right? Now I want to apply for administrative programs. Now I'm looking at my classroom in a different way. I'm moving into coaching spaces. And all of that happened as a result of a 15-second interaction. So that to me was pretty pivotal.
Well, and sometimes that is what really give us the perspective to say, man, you know
Yes.
what? Yes, man, I think I can. And
Yeah.
by someone saying it, and as you mentioned, the power of words, just by saying, man, you look good in that seat, that space. Now you start to see yourself in that based on what he have said to you and stuff like that. So I think sometimes we can help others to
Yes.
really step into a role by just saying what we think they are capable of doing.
Yes.
Uh,
Affirming.
yes,
Affirming
yes,
space, right? And now, of course, we talk about this in very technical terms, but that's what affirmation is about. It's not long winded, right? It's a reminder of what I see, right? And that's huge.
man. I think that is important. And we have an obligation to help others to see themselves beyond where they are. And
Yes.
so that's a great reminder to all of us, to everyone listening, that we all can play a role in helping someone to see themselves beyond where they are currently.
Yes.
So that leads me to my next question. What life lesson have you learned late in life that you believe is important and can benefit this current generation?
I think a life lesson that I learned was at the end of the day, I'm accountable to me.
Wow.
Right. I spent, and to some extent still am, a people pleaser, right? People not being happy with me, right, impacts my emotions, right, in some instances. And so I spent a lot of time trying to do what I thought other people wanted me to do in hopes that that would be enough, right? And so parents wanted me to go to law school, and I didn't want to go to law school, but I like went through all the rigmarole to apply and all this other stuff. There were certain roles and positions people wanted me to serve in. At the end of the day, all of those experiences have brought me to that realization. Now, at the end of the day, I'm accountable for me, and that's not only my professional career, but that's my personal life, that's my spiritual life, right? Like I'm accountable to me, and there's so many videos and things out there that would fight that statement, right? That would say actually there are all these other things that you are accountable to. But I would argue against that, and I would say ultimately, like my biggest takeaway has been I'm accountable to me. I need to at the end every morning be able to wake up and look myself in the mirror and say I did what I was designed to do, and when I'm in spaces that I am not serving or not serving me, I have the responsibility to remove myself from places and spaces and people,
Yeah.
right? Who don't line up with that
I believe that is important because you're right. At the end of the day, you have to know that am I being in this, is this space really benefiting me or I'm making any contribution to this space? And if we can't make those decisions, we may find ourselves in spaces that we are miserable and show
Yes.
up anyway, but not understanding that, what, yes, you can remove yourself. You don't have to be there just because other people want you to be there. At the end of the day, you're right. We have to be accountable to ourselves. And I think that is important. And a great reminder as well. I think there's a quote out there, society may want you to be everything else but yourself. So it's just to understand that we don't have to be, because if you're there and you're not being you, then who are you being? And do you like who the space force you to be? And I think it's always great and a good reminder to all of us, because we want to show up in the spaces and be the best that we can be and make the most impact that we can make. So I think that is a great reminder. So my next question, before my final question, where can the listeners find and support the work that you're doing to make a difference?
Yes, yes. So thank you for that. There are a few spaces. If you are on social media, you can follow us on Twitter or Instagram at NYCMBK. For any sisters that are listening, we also have My Sister's Keeper. Same thing, Twitter and Instagram, and that our tag is MSKNYCPS. So follow us on social media, leave comments, like celebrate our young people, because that's the purpose of our social media. And then, of course, for those who are interested in doing some more direct work, i.e. mentoring or some other direct tasks or programs with our young people, you can either contact us through our website, which is nycmbk.org, or you can email me, mbethea, the number 4, at schools.nyc.gov.
Man, thank you for sharing that. And I will definitely put it somewhere in the description so they can reach out to you and support, especially with the I'm mentoring.
Yes.
Because people can provide their time from anywhere. And so I'll
Yes.
definitely share it in the description so they can continue to support or start supporting if they haven't been supporting yet. So I'll definitely share that. So my final question is, what impact do you want to have on the world?
That's a big question. I I think ultimately when I leave this place, I want people to say he was a good guy who did good work, right? And I think that'll, because when I think about impact, I don't only think about my daily work, right? My 9 to 5,
Right.
right? But impact is about kind of what we do in the in between spaces. It's what we do when no one's watching. It's what we're doing in our personal and our social lives. And so my I want my impact. I want to leave without taking away anything, right? I don't want to cause harm. And ultimately, if I can do that, right? If I can do that, then I feel like it's a job well done. If it's more directly around my work, I would say I would want my impact to be that both my brother's keeper and my sister's keeper become largely funded, stabilized initiatives in every school in New York City, right? I would want to see all 1,600 of our schools have MBK and MSK programming, and we're working on it. But that would be amazing to see that come to fruition.
Man, that's awesome. And I know some of the schools would really greatly impacted, but just by having those initiatives in their schools. Just to give the young people an opportunity or more opportunities can be very beneficial to them. And as you said, our goal is to make a tremendous impact, to leave the place better than we find it, and don't really take from it, but just to add to the world. And I think if we show up like that, with that mindset, things will be different. because that's what we're here for, to provide service whilst we are here. And if our service really makes things better, that is what living is about. And so, Dr. Bethea, man, it was great having you here on the Black Male Impact. And as always, our goal is to inspire positive change. Thanks for being here with us and sharing such insights and perspective and how we can make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. And as always, listeners, our goal is to keep making a difference. And we really appreciate the support that you have been giving us, and continue to like, support, and share the work that we're doing here at the Black Male Impact with the world. Thank you for being here with us. And as always, continue to be the best that you can be.